Hi everyone, this is Jonathan Cedillo, a student at Grand Canyon University, and today I'm going to be talking about the disorders in the vestibular apparatus. Presentation for the class Biology 515, Concepts of Human Physiology 1, Professor Sandra Barrera. The vestibular apparatus. This is responsible for several functions that are in communication with the brain by the neural connections and the stimuli provided by this same system. This includes motion, head position, and spatial orientation. Alterations or damages to the vestibular system can bring negative consequences to an organism. According to the article Hormones and Vestibular Disorders, The Quest for Biomarkers by Rislane L. Chiari et al., these negative effects can be presented in the form of symptoms that vary from postural locomotor functions to mental illness, such as persistent postural perceptual dizziness, known as PPPD, and downregulation of common physiological and biological needs. The symptoms vary according to their progression, affecting muscles, the brain, and other areas. Also, it is important to take into consideration the care of the symptoms of patients. The pathologies presented by the malfunction of the vestibular apparatus extend to a variety of effects involving several effectors, which are the substances within the organisms whose presence is an indicator of this disease, known as biomarkers. It is imperative to follow along with the symptoms presented by patients, especially if they present signs of vertigo syndrome. Tracing the disorder will influence the impact of the therapeutic methods and will also allow the targeting of the correct and specific biomarkers. Furthermore, the regulation of hormones plays a critical role in as the sources of biomarkers for the areas of the ear, nose, and throat. Scientists confirm that the presence of known hormones will lead to the diagnosis of vestibular irregularities if present. They also know that the appearance of vertigo syndrome is a combination of hormonal changes that can be quantified. The paper presented targets an overview of the hormonal effects that interrupt the vestibular system and presents its regularities. The author of this article gathered data from the past 2 decades using databases such as Medline and Cochrane to correlate pathologies and hormonal changes affecting the vestibular apparatus. With this image, I'm showing you the segments that relate to the vestibular system. These encompass vestibulospinal pathway, VSP, the vestibulo-ocular pathway, VOP, the superior vestibular nuclei, SVN, the medial vestibular nuclei, MVN, and the lateral vestibular nuclei, LVN, and finally, the inferior vestibular nuclei, IVN. These segments are right here. I'm pointing with my pointer, and they are in colors, so that way you can differentiate and then you can trace the activity that they provide to different parts of the organism. Now, let's go ahead and discuss the article Hormones and Vestibular Disorders, The Quest for Biomarkers by Rislane L. Chiari et al. In this presentation, 3 points will be analyzed and discussed. Point number 1, vestibular impairments. The vestibule apparatus might impact important activities in different anatomical areas as shown in the image. Each arrow correlates to a specific region pertaining to the vestibular system and the function that it has towards the other regions of the body. For instance, the authors of the paper claim that the vestibulospinal pathway, or VSP, plays an essential role in the regulation of the trunk and leg muscles, which controls the activity of the kinetics presented by such parts of the body, adapting to different situations to keep the body standing or avoid falling. In the same article, Chiari et al. Point out that the vestibulo-ocular reflex is in charge of controlling the reflexes that allow the establishment and balance of the muscles that control the eye movement when the head is moving, allowing them to maintain a fixed position to look at an object. Also, Chiari mentions that starting from the 1900s, experts acquire more fundamentals about the connection between the brainstem vestibular nuclei to the hypothalamic pituitary complex. Documentation points out that there is evidence of the functional network between vegetative brainstem centers and vestibular nuclei neurovegetative regulation. Having these basis of such work, animal models were put into practices studying the effects of gravitational forces. Other scientists use this knowledge to study the vestibular control effect in the regulation of chronobiological activities such as sleep, thermoregulation, food intake, and bone reconstruction. In addition, Chiari stated that there is a correlation between the vestibule and cognition, which is validated through experimentation including effects on memory, spatial navigation, and proprioception, which is body self awareness. Athletes might find this feature very useful. Continuing, the vestibulocortical pathway has shown relevant information between its connections to emotions. Recent findings by the International Classification of Vestibular Disorders, or the ICVD, pointed out a relative new syndrome, persistent postural perceptual dizziness, PPPD, which implies posture perception disruptions and mental deficits. Also, there has been evidence that damaged tissue of the peripheral and central vestibular pathways has a negative effect that correlates to postural locomotor functions and PPPD. These effects vary in the way they affect the organs of an individual. The symptoms range according to their effects and effectors that can be biomarkers, which allows the labeling of diseases and their stages of vestibular anomalies. Therefore, it is extremely imperative to look closely if a patient presents vertigo, to follow up with its progression and therapies applied, and to target the correct biomarkers. Point number 2, vestibular disorders and hormonal dysregulation. Within the same article, the authors analyzed the relation between the endocrine and vestibular systems. Data point out that mammals present an array of hormones in the vestibular system, such as aldosterone, testosterone, progesterone, and estradiol, were localized across epithelial cells of the endolymphatic sac of mammals. In addition, vasopressin kinetics across epithelial tissue and its changes between perilymph and endolymph fluids of the inner ear has demonstrated a role in the accumulation of hydrops related to Meniere's disease, and association to motion sickness. It seems that activation of the vestibular networks also activates the central secretory nuclei that might upregulate endocrine alterations. In response, this stimulates the paraventricular and supraoptic nucleus. Later, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, in the paraventricular hypothalamic nuclei induces responses in the hypothalamic pituitary axis to deliver thyrotropin stimulating hormone, or TSH. Also, when stimulating the vestibular system, activation of the sympathetic networks might occur together with the hypothalamic pituitary axis with regulation of several hormones. The vestibular system delivers signals to the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which can be related to the secretion of melatonin and serotonin in conjunction with neurons that are related to arousal, wakefulness, and appetite. Interestingly, receptors of hormones such as vasopressin, cortisol, insulin, and sex hormones are synthesized at the inner ear and across the brainstem vestibular nuclei. In addition, the article talks about the correlation between levels of hormones and vertigo syndrome. The results suggest that vasopressin, cortisol, and parathormone hormones are upregulated during a vertigo situation of patients that also present Meniere's disease. This is pointing out to scientists that levels of these hormones flowing through the vascular system can be used as biomarkers separating the stages of a vertigo attack, with the probability that differentiation between vestibular pathologies can be spotted. Another disease mentioned in the article states that benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, or BPPV, is more common in women that have already gone through menopause, and that vestibular migraines are connected to hormonal dysfunctionalities. After analyzing this data, observations have been made which suggest that structural, functional, and epidemiological evidence point out the correlation between vestibular system and specific hormone levels. Point number 3, hormonal dysregulations as biomarkers. The presence of biomarkers in an organism implies an indicative of a specific disease. However, there are some conditions to label as substance a biomarker, such as a single hormonal variation and coordinated hormonal variations that must be identified at the correct progression of a disease. In this case, the target of vestibular irregularity. If we consider each vestibular disease, including etiology, the neural connections that play a role, organs, parts of the brain, time, and the array of hormonal variations can be identified which represent the presence of biomarkers. However, this substance must be measurable and able to quantify. The authors of the previously discussed article state that tests are often run to identify the levels of sex, thyroid, and adrenal hormones. They also say that chemoluminescence immunoassays can be used to analyze samples of blood and quantify hormonal levels. However, other hormones are tested with other techniques like radioimmunology due to their sensitivity, such as in the case of children's hormones. To conclude this presentation, the author of the article states that the testing of hormonal levels in blood sample is not a common practice when a patient shows indications of vestibular disease. Nonetheless, this practice could be implemented according to the patient's needs, accessibility of the patient, and tests that are provided by the hospitals or clinics in which the patient is being treated. It is crucial to test the types of hormones levels in the organism of a patient to provide reliable results of the correct vestibular disorder. If assays to study the concentration of hormones are carried out with consistency, physicians and scientists will be able to cross a line that will allow them to develop diagnostic tools and therapies for vestibular diseases. That's the end of my presentation.